Previously on Win 9X.
When people think of the classic Namco arcade games that swept the world in the 1980s, most tend to think of Pac-Man, with Galaga coming in at a close second.
I've already covered the Galaga ports in a previous video, so it's only natural that I'd cover Pac-Man next. As you can see in my great selection of arcade cabinets at home, I enjoy these games a fair amount. And while Galaga might have been a hit in the arcades, Pac-Man outright redefined them. Released in 1980, Pac-Man absolutely demolished the sales charts and made the maze game a viable genre. And after the incredible success of Pac-Man, home releases were a given. Atari decided they wanted first dibs on Pac-Man and thus purchased the exclusive rights to console versions of the game. And with that purchase, production on one of the most infamous arcade ports ever made began. Before we start with the actual video, allow me to shamelessly plug. I've got a Discord server now. Come join and hang out if you'd like. The link is in the description. Imagine this. It's 1982, and Atari is on top of the home console market in the US. With the 2600 absolutely obliterating sales with arcade ports and original games, they seem to be living large with no chance to fail. So of course Atari fucking died. But that's jumping ahead of the story, so let's rewind back a bit. 1983 was going to be a huge year for the 2600, with the headlining titles being a game adaptation of the smash hit film E.T. and a long-awaited home port of, you guessed it, Pac-Man. There's only one problem with these plans. Atari rushed these games to hell and back, and thus made two safe hits into two of the most infamously awful video games ever made. Pac-Man on the Atari 2600 is objectively terrible, and there's very little else you can say about it. The graphics are absolutely awful, the mazes are cut in half from 244 pellets to 126, and the gameplay is very poor to say the absolute least. The ghost's stray turns being on the screen every frame, which leads to this horrible flicker effect that just hurts to look at after a while. And while you might expect a shitty port to fail hard, the sheer brand power of Pac-Man led this game to skyrocket directly up to the top of the sales charts. It became the best-selling 2600 game ever released. But good sales never equal good reviews, as this port was heavily maligned by most reviewers, just like its ill-fated brother, E.T. Overall, the Atari port of Pac-Man was just not enough to save Atari, and thus led to the video game market crash of 1983. So, going from a game console that can barely run Pong to one that can actually play a video game that resembles, well, a video game, Pac-Man has oddly two ports to the NES. One was handled in-house by Namco, while the other was published by Tengen, the Atari subsidiary that was created to circumvent both publisher restrictions and the NES lockout chip. The Namco release is pretty indicative of their NES ports at the time, being a port of the MSX code to the NES. It's close enough to the arcade to be playable, but is graphically and audially worse in almost every way. The best way to show this would probably be the intermission. Take a look. Pac-Man by Tengen, though, isn't very interesting. While with my wording you might expect it to be different, it's unfortunately identical outside the title screen and box art. Quite disappointing. If you'll allow me to cheat for a second, I want to talk about Miss Pac-Man. It's close enough, right? Miss Pac-Man has two ports that are of interest to this video, the NES and Genesis. On the NES, Namco and Tengen once again handled two separate releases, but unlike regular Pac-Man on the NES, there are considerable differences between these two. The best way to explain this one would be to do a side-by-side comparison. Tengen Miss Pac-Man is just better in every way though. It's full screen with more accurate controls and sound. Namco's plays much slower and it's not as fun. The Namco port's shoddy quality is even more inexcusable when you realize that Miss Pac-Man from Tengen came out 3 years earlier in 1990 and is leagues better. It really should have been the only port released, but Tengen got into a heck of a lot of legal trouble thanks to their NES lockout circumvention. This meant the superior version was super unlicensed, which meant Namco had to rush a release out to keep Miss Pac-Man on shelves. If you want more information on the whole Tengen debacle, I highly recommend taking a look at the Gaming Historian's video on the subject, which will be linked in the description. Now on to the Genesis. Miss Pac-Man was ported by Tengen, and it's based off their amazing NES port, thus there's not a lot to say on it, it's just a great version all around. Namco didn't even bother making their own version and just licensed the Tengen version, which was the right call, as this port's incredible. Next, I'd like to cover some of the strangest ports of the original Pac-Man that ended up hidden in one of the weirdest games in the entire franchise, Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures. The SNES and Genesis versions both have Pac-Man hidden in the arcades and behind a cheat code, and strangely both use updated ports of the NES version. These two versions are near identical, but the sound's a bit better on the Genesis version, weirdly enough. These ports are fine enough as bonuses, but aren't replacements for the original game, not even close. Lastly, I'm gonna cheat again. Pac-Mania, released in 1987, is an isometric take on the original Pac-Man, which I just so happen to love. It got a few different ports, namely to the Sega Genesis and NES. This port has by far the worst looking title screen I think I've ever seen. It looks horrible. And unfortunately, the graphics aren't very far off from that. This game looks horrible, with drab colors and incredibly awful sprite work. But the gameplay is its saving factor, as it's very close to the arcade. It's snappy, hops feel great, controls pretty well, and it sounds pretty close to the arcade. This was yet another port handled by Tengen, and as far as I'm concerned, they really should have focused on keeping their company afloat and not Namco ports, because holy hell, these ports are great. Now, since Pac-Man was released at the height of the NES's success, it just had to get a port to that system too. And well, by some miracle, the NES port of Pac-Mania is really good. Graphically it stinks, but of course it does. For 1987, Pac-Mania looked really ahead of its time, and there's no way they managed to get that onto the NES perfectly. Instead, they focused on making the game perform and play just as well as the arcade did. Hops feel perfect, the turns are snappy, and the game manages to run at a locked frame rate with no slowdown. This port is yet again brought to us by the Wizards, a Tengen's Namco porting team, which explains why it's actually half decent. There is no shortage of ways to play Pac-Man and its many sequels at home. Just about every platform ever released has gotten a version of Pac-Man at some point, and while some are very solid and work quite well, others are just a little bit Pac-Man on Atari 2600. The fact that we've reached a point in technology where arcade-perfect releases of games are commonplace and weird reprograms like these are effectively extinct is quite impressive. In the 90s, you had to settle for a shoddy port to your Game Gear and deal with it, while today you can simply whip out your phone and enjoy the complete game wherever you want. But there's still lots of these weird ports out there, and I'm not done covering them just yet. Next time on Win Night X, I'm going to be covering the ports of Galaxian that have been shoved out over the years. Stay tuned.